Welcome to this deep dive. We're going to be unpacking some seriously thought-provoking ideas about the Quran and the Gospel. And, you might be surprised to learn we're going to be looking at the connections between these two texts.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to the identity of the children of Israel.
Right.
And their relationship with prophets like Jesus.
Yes. And to help guide us through all this, we'll be using Dr. Khaled Waleed's work.
Okay.
Did Jesus command worshiping him?
Okay.
He offers a really unique perspective, challenging some conventional interpretations of both Christianity and Islam.
So let's jump right into it. Dr. Waleed, he focuses on Surah Al-Ma'idah,
Yes.
or the feast, from the Quran, specifically verses 114 to 120.
Right.
And he connects this feast to the revelation of the gospel.
That's right. He argues that this feast, it symbolizes the arrival of a new divine knowledge with Jesus.
Wow.
And this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Dr. Waleed, he asserts that none of God's prophets, including Jesus, are from the children of Israel.
Whoa, that's a big claim. What evidence does he use to back that up?
Well, he points to verses 116 and 117 of the same surah,
Okay.
where Allah questions Jesus directly.
Okay.
Did he tell people to worship him and marry?
Right.
And Jesus' response is very clear. He denies ever claiming divinity. He emphasizes that he only called people to worship Allah.
So right there in the Quran, we see a rejection of the idea that Jesus claimed to be divine.
Exactly.
How does this connect to the gospel?
So Dr. Waleed, he draws this fascinating parallel with a passage in the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verses 1 through 59. It's the story where the Pharisees bring a woman accused of adultery to Jesus,
Right.
intending to stone her, according to Mosaic law.
Right, I remember that story. Jesus challenges them with that famous line, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone."
Exactly, and the ensuing dialogue is really crucial. Jesus' words and actions, they directly challenge the Pharisees' understanding of their own lineage and faith. He questions their claim to be the true children of Israel, implying that their actions don't align with God's will.
So if the traditional understanding of the children of Israel is being challenged, then who are they according to Dr. Waleed?
Well, he points to Quranic verses that mention a prophet named Israel who, according to his interpretation, went astray and disobeyed God.
Okay.
This figure, he argues, represents the origin of misinterpretations and deviation from the true message of God.
Wait, so the Quran talks about a prophet named Israel who didn't follow God's teachings?
That's Dr. Waleed's interpretation. And he builds on this to argue that the true children of Israel aren't defined by lineage, but by their belief in their actions. He suggests that true lineage is spiritual, connected to upholding God's message.
So we're seeing this really different perspective on who the children of Israel are.
Right.
But how does that connect back to Jesus and his message?
Well, Dr. Waleed argues that both the Quran and the Gospel portray Jesus as someone who constantly directs people back to worshiping God alone.
Okay.
Rejecting any notion of his own divinity, he embodies the true spirit of faith, uncorrupted by worldly desires.
And that's where his interpretation of the Trinity comes in, right?
Exactly. Dr. Waleed presents a unique understanding of the Trinity, diverging from that traditional Christian view.
Okay.
He sees it as God the Father, Jesus as the perfect reflection of God's word, and the Holy Spirit as the divine connection between God and humanity.
So it's a Trinity of God, the embodiment of God's message, and the way that message reaches us.
Exactly.
That's definitely a fresh perspective.
It is. And it underscores his main argument. True faith lies in recognizing God's oneness and rejecting any attempts to elevate human beings to the level of divinity.
And that leads us to Dr. Waleed's call for Christians to return to God.
Yeah.
And reject what he calls the religion of Satan, the magician. What exactly does he mean by that?
He's essentially saying that the traditional Christian understanding of Jesus's divinity and the Trinity, in his view, is a distortion of God's true message. He sees it as a form of idolatry that has led people away from the core principles of faith.
So he sees the focus on Jesus's divinity as a distraction from the true message of worshiping the one God.
Precisely. He believes that by attributing divinity to Jesus, Christians have created this unnecessary intermediary between themselves and God, ultimately hindering their connection to the divine.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. It's definitely giving me a lot to think about.
It's challenging.
It's challenging some deeply ingrained ideas about Christianity and Islam
Yeah.
and their historical figures.
And that's what makes Dr. Waleed's work so compelling. He's asking us to reconsider our assumptions and look at these texts with fresh eyes.
Yeah.
Which is exactly what we're doing in this deep dive. It is challenging, isn't it? Especially when we think about how Dr. Waleed isn't just critiquing, he's drawing this parallel. You see this perceived straying from God's message in traditional Christianity as echoing the straying of the prophet Israel mentioned in the Quran.
Yeah, that's a really interesting connection. So it circles back to this idea that being a true child of Israel is about aligning yourself with God's teachings.
Exactly.
Regardless of your actual lineage.
Exactly. It raises the question, is it about who your ancestors were? Right. Or about the principles you embody? Dr. Waleed seems to be emphasizing the latter.
Yeah, that definitely shifts the perspective, doesn't it? It makes you wonder about the implications of redefining children of Israel in that way.
Absolutely. It challenges traditional interpretations of both religious texts and historical narratives. And it could potentially even open up new avenues for understanding the relationship between these two faiths.
Speaking of relationships between faiths, Dr. Waleed doesn't shy away from addressing the connection between Christianity and Islam. He actually goes so far as to say that the Quran affirms the truth of the gospel.
That's right. He sees the Quran not as contradicting the gospel,
Right,
but as continuing and confirming the original message that was revealed to Jesus. Both texts, in his view, ultimately point towards the same core truth, the oneness of God.
He's also very critical of what he perceives as deviations from that original message.
And it is. He calls for a return to what he believes is the unadulterated essence of faith, a faith that is centered on the worship of the one God, without intermediaries or attributing divinity to human beings.
It's a bold stance for sure. It makes you think about how these different interpretations can impact interfaith dialogue.
It certainly does. Dr. Waleed's perspective is thought-provoking because it suggests that there might be more common ground between Christianity and Islam than traditional interpretations acknowledge. And he also brings in the gospel, referencing Matthew 15.24, where Jesus says, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." The source argues that by referencing lost sheep, Jesus implies that the children of Israel had strayed from their true past, potentially supporting the idea of a spiritual lineage, rather than a purely genealogical one.
So he's using both the Quran and the gospel to kind of build this alternate perspective on who the children of Israel really are.
Precisely. And this leads to another fascinating aspect of the source. How both texts depict Jesus interacting with the children of Israel.
And we know from the outline that Dr. Waleed actually focuses on Jesus cursing the children of Israel.
Yes.
What's that all about?
He points to verses in both the Quran and Gospel where Jesus rebukes the children of Israel for their disbelief and hypocrisy. For example, in the Gospel of Matthew 23.33, Jesus says, "You snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell?"
Wow, that's pretty strong language.
It is. And the source uses this passage, along with others, to argue that Jesus was deeply critical of the children of Israel's actions and spiritual state. He connects this back to his argument about lineage, suggesting that their actions prove they were not the true inheritors of God's favor.
So the source is building a connection between lineage, belief, and actions.
Exactly.
He's saying true lineage is determined by faith and adherence to God's message, not just by bloodline.
Exactly. And that's a key theme throughout his analysis. He examines how the Quran depicts the children of Israel portraying various prophets as sinners, furthering his argument about their spiritual corruption.
This is getting really interesting. We'll dive into those examples and more when we continue our deep dive.
Definitely.
So welcome back to our deep dive into Dr. Waleed's exploration of the Quran and Gospel. We're uncovering some pretty surprising interpretations about the children of Israel.
Indeed. We left off with Dr. Waleed's analysis of how Jesus rebuked the children of Israel for their disbelief. The source also uses verses from the Quran to support this point.
What does the Quran say about Jesus and the children of Israel?
In Surah Al-Ma'idah 5.72, the Quran states, "They have certainly disbelieved who say, Allah is the Messiah, the son of Mary, while the Messiah has said, O children of Israel, worship Allah, my Lord and your Lord." The source argues that this verse, alongside the gospel passages we discussed earlier, demonstrates how Jesus himself refuted any claims of divinity, and rebuked the children of Israel for straying from the true path of worshiping Allah.
So the source is claiming both the Quran and the Gospel present Jesus as a devout prophet of Allah.
Precisely.
Correcting the children of Israel for their misguided beliefs.
Yeah, and Dr. Waleed goes even further, claiming that the Quran reveals a pattern of the children of Israel, misrepresenting and maligning other prophets as well.
This is where it gets really interesting. What examples does he give?
Well, he examines several instances, including the portrayal of Noah in Surah Nu 71.2123. The Quran states, and Noah said, "My Lord, indeed they have disobeyed me and followed one whose wealth and children will not increase him except in loss." The source argues that this verse, along with others, reveals how the children of Israel depicted Noah as someone who was disobeyed and disregarded, downplaying his status as a prophet.
So the Quran is actually revealing how the children of Israel may have distorted the image of Noah.
That's the source's interpretation. He applies a similar analysis to the stories of other prophets, like David, Abraham, and Lot.
Let's talk about David. What does the source say about him?
The source points to Surah Sada 38.24, where the Quran says, "He said, he has certainly wronged you by asking for your ewe to add to his own flock. And indeed, many associates oppress one another, except for those who believe and do righteous deeds, and few are they." The source claims that this verse alludes to a narrative where the children of Israel accuse David of wrongdoing, potentially hinting at their efforts to tarnish his reputation.
It sounds like Dr. Waleed is meticulously examining the Quran to uncover a hidden narrative that challenges traditional views of these prophets and their relationships with the children of Israel.
That's precisely his approach. He examines the story of Abraham as well. In Surah Al-Anbiya 21.5157, the Quran mentions Abraham smashing idols and confronting his people about their idolatry. The source argues that the children of Israel, while claiming to follow Abraham's legacy, engaged in practices similar to the idolatry that Abraham condemned, thus distorting his message.
So according to Dr. Waleed, the Quran isn't just telling stories about these prophets. It's also subtly revealing how their messages and images were manipulated by the children of Israel.
That's the argument he's building. And this leads to one of the most intriguing examples he discusses, the story of Lot.
This is the story where he challenges the traditional interpretation of Lot offering his daughters to a mob. In Surah Hud 11.78, the Quran describes Lot's interaction with the people who came to his house. While many interpretations focus on the word banat, traditionally translated as daughters, Dr. Waleed offers a different perspective. He emphasizes that banat can also mean thoughts in Arabic. So he's saying Lot offered his thoughts or spiritual insights, not his actual daughters.
That's his argument. He believes this interpretation aligns better with the Quran's overall message and Lot's character as a righteous prophet.
This is a fascinating example of how linguistic analysis and different interpretations can dramatically change our understanding of religious texts.
It certainly highlights the complexities involved in interpreting ancient scripture. And Dr. Waleed's work encourages us to be aware of these complexities and to engage with these texts on a deeper level.
Well, we've definitely gone deep in this part of our dive. There's still much more to explore.
Yeah.
So stay with us as we continue to uncover Dr. Waleed's insights in the final part of our exploration.
Looking forward to it.
Welcome back to our deep dive, into Dr. Waleed's exploration of the Quran and Gospel. We've been uncovering some really fascinating and sometimes surprising interpretations about the children of Israel.
It's been quite a journey through these texts, hasn't it?
It really has.
Dr. Waleed certainly challenges traditional understandings.
He does.
And encourages a deeper level of engagement.
With the Quran and the Gospel.
We've talked about his arguments regarding lineage and how he uses both texts to show Jesus rebuking the children of Israel. And then we explored how he analyzes Quranic verses. To suggest a pattern of the children of Israel misrepresenting various prophets.
From Noah and David to Abraham and even Lot, Dr. Waleed highlights specific verses that he believes point to this pattern of distortion.
Right.
It's a compelling argument that makes you reconsider the traditional narratives surrounding these prophets.
It really does, and it goes back to his central point.
It does.
About the importance of carefully examining the text.
Yes.
And considering alternative interpretation.
Absolutely. He encourages us to move beyond surface-level readings.
Right.
And delve into the nuances of language and historical context. His interpretation of the story of Lot and his Banat being thoughts rather than daughters is a prime example of this.
Yeah.
It challenges us to think critically about the assumptions we bring to these texts.
Yes, and to consider the possibility that there might be more to uncover than we initially realize.
So what's the key takeaway for our listeners?
Wow.
What does Dr. Waleed ultimately want us to understand about the Quran, the Gospel, and the children of Israel? So if we're looking at these texts with fresh eyes, as Dr. Waleed encourages us to do, what are some key takeaways we can glean from his analysis?
Well, first and foremost, I think it emphasizes the importance of critical thinking. He's urging us to question assumptions, to not simply accept traditional interpretations at face value, but to engage with the texts ourselves.
So it's about taking ownership of our understanding of faith.
Precisely. And recognizing that these are living texts, open to interpretation and reinterpretation. What resonates with you might not resonate with someone else, and that's okay.
It's like he's saying, don't just take my word for it. Go explore these texts yourself and see what you discover.
Exactly. He's inviting us on a journey of exploration and discovery. And who knows, maybe it leads to a more nuanced and inclusive understanding of both Christianity and Islam.
Maybe even a stronger sense of shared humanity in the process.
Absolutely. After all, despite their differences, both Christianity and Islam emphasize values like love, compassion, and justice. Perhaps by focusing on those shared values, we can start to bridge the divides that have separated us for far too long.
Yeah, it's amazing to think about how much common ground there might be, even between faiths that are often seen as being at odds. This deep dive has really opened my eyes to that possibility.
It's truly fascinating, isn't it? And it speaks to the power of perspective. You know, Dr. Waleed's interpretation, while challenging it, encourages us to look beyond the surface.
Right.
And delve into those deeper layers of meaning within these texts.
Yeah, it makes you realize that there's always more to learn and new ways to understand even the most familiar ideas.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that that journey of learning and discovery, especially when it comes to matters of faith, it's ongoing.
I'm curious, what stands out to you the most about Dr. Waleed's approach?
I think it's his courage to question these deeply ingrained beliefs. He doesn't shy away from challenging those traditional interpretations, even when those interpretations are widely accepted.
Yeah.
And, you know, that kind of intellectual honesty is crucial for meaningful dialogue, both within and between faiths.
It's like he's saying, don't be afraid to think for yourself. Question everything. Engage with the text. Wrestle with the ideas.
Exactly. And through that process, we might find ourselves arriving at a more nuanced and inclusive understanding of faith. And who knows, maybe it even leads to a greater sense of unity and shared purpose.
So if we were to entertain Dr. Waleed's interpretations, what could this mean for interfaith dialogue and understanding between Christians and Muslims going forward?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think it opens up some really exciting possibilities. What if we could move beyond, you know, all that historical baggage and focus on the shared values that unite us? What if we could find common ground in our shared humanity and our desire to connect with the divine?
It's almost like he's suggesting this paradigm shift in how we approach interfaith relations. Instead of focusing on the differences, what if we emphasize the commonalities? The shared pursuit of truth, justice, and compassion.
Precisely. It's a powerful vision, and one worth striving for.
This has been such a thought-provoking deep dive. I feel like I've only just scratched the surface of these complex ideas.
And that's the beauty of it. This isn't about finding those definitive answers, but about opening up those new avenues of inquiry, encouraging that deeper reflection, and fostering greater understanding.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to be thinking about these ideas for a long time to come. It's definitely inspired me to go back and reread both the Quran and the Gospel, paying closer attention to the nuances and those layers of meaning that we've explored today.
That's wonderful, and I encourage all of our listeners to do the same. Explore Dr. Waleed's work. Engage with the source material. What resonates with you? What challenges your existing beliefs? What new insights do you glean?
The journey of learning and discovery doesn't end here. Let's keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.
Beautifully said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.